Wonderful presentation. Actually, your research prompts me to think so many things, but I will try to summarize that. And these are not the questions, and these are some of my observations, because you have talked about that land and water connection and the labor, what it took. I mean, if we say that Gyan Prakash was bonded histories in which is on South Bihar, that also talks about that social relations of water and how it works on the center in the question of servitude and that kind of this thing, I mean the extraction. So what I think that important is infrastructure, socio-ecological change. We should also talk about that extraction and communication. If we think about Nitin Sinha's work, he also talks about the communication aspects and what he was talking about. If I connect it, the land acquisition question and the railways, you can also see that article written by Sriti Kumar Sarkar, that is on Bengal, that published in Studies in History. So that we can do, yes. For Bombay, I am not much aware with that region, but you talked about the protection of the railway site, of the infrastructural site. Ritika Prasad talked very little about that though, but when we are talking about the Bengal, in terms of Bengal and embankment, if you see that Bengal embankment manual, there it is also written over there that what protection it was their utmost superior. I mean, they paid so much attention to that. And if we say that labor who were participating in that infrastructural work, so not only being an economic historian, if we see through the perspective of environmental historian, as you have worked, that the disaster. So disaster opened up that scope to participate in that infrastructural venture, which was also performed, I mean guided by and inspired by that governmental initiative, though it manifested in a different way. And social aspects, if we say that the social relations, gender, the question of gender, caste hierarchy, that came up with a different phase of different notion in the wake of disaster and in the aftermath of the disaster. And what I would say that you have started with coal and that railway and deforestation was also there. There are so many works, needless to say, with any specific emphasis. But if we connect it, if we started from coal, then we should say something about that Geological Survey of India, GSI, because GSI in its memoirs, voluminous memoirs are there, and it talked about, it is mentioned over there in so many memoirs that how coal has been extracted, and that was also an infrastructural process. The discovery of coal, the marking that area, they were putting labor over there, and that started from the end of that 18th century. So when we are 18th century, I mean from 1772, 78, that was also started in a very unorganizational way. But it was from the beginning of the 19th century, they were doing it in a more organizational way. And when GSI was started to venture in the field of earthquake research, that was more after 1850s. So it was already so established that the communication connection, railways. So coal, when they invented coal or oil, if I am giving some example about that, when tea was invented in northern part of Bengal, Darjeeling, so how railway has been extended from now today's Bangladesh via Siliguri to Darjeeling, and for Assam, for coal and oil from Bangladesh to Assam via this Coach Bihar and northern Bengal, and Coach Bihar by that time was part of that British administration. So I mean, if we say that coal or oil, these things, they prompted or they inspired that ideologies of extraction, which had also some ecological issues also that incorporated the marginal people, marginalized people, that we have seen the British forest policies and the famines in Bengal, Odisha famine specifically, or Bengal, Bihar famine beneath the Damodar and Bakrit. So there we should also keep in mind about that thing when coal-like things or oil, that prompted the the generation or the introduction of another step of infrastructure. I mean, coal, oil, that was doing on the first half of the 19th century, bauxite and other things, and railways that came in the second half of the 19th centuries. So there was also some sort of ideologies of extraction that also guided the government initiative to build up infrastructure. So how do you think that the ideology of extraction it worked? Because that also needed the infrastructural setting that the government had to introduce, and the another step like railways or roadways. So for Ravi Ahuja, he worked on that roadways. So that also took another step. So how do you connect that ecological extraction and that infrastructural building?
Thank you so much for these comments, Dr. Ghosh. I just want to go back to where you started with the comments on different previous works, and I should definitely also, as you mentioned, Jan Prakash's work on South Bihar, I should revisit that. That's a very good idea. And Nitinsen's work I'm of course quite familiar with. I worked with him in the Bihar State Archives from my other project. When he was then working on some publications that you mentioned. So those have been a great inspiration for me also. I think it's a good idea, like this, the coal came in quite late in this project, and of course the cotton has been seen as one of these main drivers of the expansion of the railways in this period, the 1860s, right? But as I showed in these maps, I mean, this was an idea, and also previous literature have shown that the idea of the railways was long-standing, and the certain areas that were, subject to extraction was there in the 1830s, 40s already, and before that, of course, also. Regarding the Geological Survey of India, these very areas are also mapped in these publications that you mentioned, the memoirs published by the Geological Survey of India. And I've also seen some other earlier river surveys of the present-day Narmada River, which is then slightly north, right, slightly further north, on how to connect those coal reserves that they find there to the railway construction, both up towards Gujarat side as well as down south, right? So the rivers are explored, but for example, the coal fields that they find, the relatively minor ones, I would say, in connection with the GRPR, are relatively what should I say, underused in connection with the railways. But I think the idea of it is interesting, as you're saying, because it is not, that coal is not initially thought of as something to extract for export. It is to bring down the cost of the railway and make it more profitable, the extraction of other natural resources, right? So it is connected to, the extractive practices are connected, and they facilitate each other, because these surveys of coal, as you rightly mentioned, are made much earlier to start with, and then followed up upon when it is noticed that coal as an energy source is very heavy and costly to export and import for the railways, and to also sustain. And interestingly, just recently, these papers I looked at the archives in Mumbai, the Indian coal then was of such inferior quality, according to these surveys, but not super inferior as such, because there were similarly inferior quality of coal in England also. So it was like a substandard of coal. But if you use this coal, you need much more preservation practices. You need more coal sheds. You need more expensive infrastructure to keep it. So there's this whole cost efficiency calculation on how to extract raw materials to feed the railways and what will benefit who, so to say. Because there are also private companies and who should build this railway, the feeders, right? So just like we see the construction of the railways, who will benefit from it? The investors, the cotton exporters, and so forth, right? Middlemen. The same with the coal feeders, because they were built then by the railway companies, but then also smaller feeders for the smaller for other coal companies that are private, right? So there is a lot of collaboration in terms of enterprise in this field. So yeah, did I answer your question there in terms of the relation between the different extractive practices? And I think it is very useful, like you mentioned, to look more at what has been done in Bengal, for example, because that's a region that has been studied extensively in terms of different ecological aspects of not just infrastructure as such, because that can be theorized as governance also is a form of infrastructure, right? If we see people as infrastructure or governance infrastructures as we talk about, right? Like, and I think that also, as I said, that 1857 and even before that, 1855, perhaps also the ideas of tools of empire, but maybe in a more nuanced way, that it becomes this infrastructure becomes one way that can kind of like change the idea of security also for the state. Like, what is security for the colonial state at certain points of time, right? That changes too. And how that security is negotiated in terms of profits, right? What kind of profits will you make by the infrastructures in this context? So, and I think if you look at infrastructural studies, there is this quite interesting special issue on what you call, I forgot the first line number, Degens is the surname. It talks about also this, that moments of crisis and disaster also, as I'm well aware of, often lay bare the weaknesses of infrastructure and how infrastructure can be changed for certain purposes. And I think that's also something to bear in mind, keep in mind here when we look at, not just the beginning of the 1860s, but the end of the 1860s, because then the cotton boom is over, and there has been a change in what is the railways there for, what is the infrastructure there for, to a certain extent, right? There's a certain, there's change in the way that the infrastructure is seen over this period also, that is difficult to exactly, pin down right now, but it is definitely different if you look from 1860 to 1865 only, in terms of how they will be used, because it is interlinked with this global set of networks of extraction at the same time. Yeah.
Any other